population size has an impact on land and the economy. And so we're going to look at local impacts, global impacts, and eventually urban impacts. If we look at highly localized impacts, these are typical of rural agricultural-based societies found in developing countries. And so if you think of a country that has to produce its own food, or communities that have to produce their own food, their own clothes, this is going to benefit the economy of that small town because the wealth stays within the economy. It's not people aren't going into a big box store to buy their food and their clothes, and that money being sent away to another community for other people to have, so that wealth stays local. However, this can lead to environmental degradation. And the environmental degradation that is common is usually land degradation and the use of woody biomass. So an example of this, if we remember, is Haiti. Haiti used to be a beautiful plush island with lots of forested area, and it was reduced for agriculture. They used slash and burn tactics to set up agricultural lands to feed their families, to feed their people, and they also needed that wood for biofuel to cook their food. And so they were doing what they needed to do to survive, but it was too much. It was a highly localized impact and too much for the ecosystem. And so the wealth of a country is oftentimes linked to the health of the soil. And so when this happened, the forested area kept the nutrients in the soil. And then when we cut down the trees and we grow a few rotations of crops, we suck out the nutrients in that soil. The soil will dry out, it erodes away with wind and water, and then that soil increases the turbidity in the river systems with the runoff. And so at this point, we have impacted the land, the soil, and the water. And so these are devastating to the economy and to the ecology of these local communities. Brazil is an example of a land overuse. So the Amazon forest is an amazing piece of the world, and 3 million acres of forested area is cleared per year. And so this is lands for small-scale agriculture. Again, people just trying to make a living and feed their family. So if we were to boost the economy, people would be able to exercise better practices or more sustainable practices. And some land is used for industrial production of soybeans and sugarcane and corn, and that is so that Brazil can compete in or be part of the global community and make exports. So converting land to agricultural use, what it does is it reduces habitats and biodiversity. We've talked quite a bit about that. It also reduces the amount of CO2 uptake by plants. So this should make sense. If you cut down a lot of plants, you're going to reduce the amount of CO2 that they take out of the atmosphere. It also increases the use of fertilizers. So if you take out the nutrients from the soil, then you need to put more back so that plants can continue to grow. And the production of these fertilizers also creates carbon emissions. So there are global impacts, and these are more common in developed countries. So if you think about countries where you have to ship in your bananas and your fruit and your coffee, these are coming from other countries, and they need to be flown in or shipped in, and so they have sometimes a greater impact. We also tend to drive cars that are made in other countries. And so I'd love to think about the example that I read about once, the voyage of a bottle of water being made. The plastic was made in China, the bottle, and then it was shipped to California so that it could get a paper wrapper put around it. And then it was transported to Maine to be filled with water, and then it was shipped back to the West Coast for dispersal. Now, if you imagine that bottle of water after taking such a voyage, somebody drinking half of it and throwing the rest away, that's quite the voyage, that's quite the distance traveled, that's quite the amount of emissions being created for a half a bottle of water. And so this is a trend that will probably reduce as we see gas prices or fuel prices increase, because it'll become less viable to ship our our goods so many places, it'll make more sense to create them all in one area. So now we're going to talk about urban impacts, or the impacts of population on urban areas. And an urban area is an area that contains more than 385 people per square kilometer, or 1,000 people per square mile. So an example of this would be New York City, which has 27,000 people per square mile, whereas Mumbai, India, has 60,000 people per square mile, which is crazy. Urban populations represent about half of the human population. However, they consume 3/4 of the Earth's resources. And so we are starting to see a trend of people moving towards urban centers. And so this means that we're going to see a trend of consumption increasing. So in developed countries or developing countries, 75% of people live in urban areas. And in developed countries, 44% of the people live in urban areas. However, we are expecting to see a rise up to 56% by 2030. So in developed countries, like the United States, urbanization can reduce the ecological footprint per capita. This is because there's less space per person, and we can use resources and share resources like public transportation. However, in both developing and developed countries, increased urbanization can have negative impacts. So it reduces the availability of affordable housing, and so people get pushed into less affordable housing. And in developing countries, we see an increase of slums and shantytowns, which are parts of the world or communities that find materials to build their houses out of garbage, etc., etc. And so the UN estimates that there are about 1 billion people that live in these squatter settlements. Increased urbanization can also have a negative effect. It can strain old sewage systems. So our growing cities have sewage systems that were made for populations that were quite a bit smaller. And so this is putting a strain and can be an expensive change. It also increases the amount of traffic. And while there is more traffic, that means there's more sitting around, and this is going to increase carbon emissions. It also can spread the amount of communicable diseases. So if you have more people in a confined area, if there's sickness, it's going to be able to spread more quickly. So sustainable development is a goal, and there are different ways to get to that goal. And so some environmental scientists argue about whether or not increasing the affluence is the way to go about it. So developing countries have to go through industrialization, and through that process they're going to release more pollution. And affluent countries use more resources. So some environmental scientists say that it is not the ideal goal or the ideal move to keep moving countries to become more and more developed. However, affluent countries eventually lead, as we have seen, to a more sustainable economy. And so if we can use the Kuznets curve, where we can leapfrog and develop the sustainable practices and bring them over to countries that can use them sooner, then we could perhaps forego some of that pollution. An example of success we have seen is in Övertorneå, Sweden, I'm guessing is how one would say that. It's a town of 5,600 people. They reclaim their economy, their failing economy, by focusing on renewable energy, local economy, and free public transportation and land preservation. So they have made a go and made their town more sustainable, and have done it for the right reasons and have had success. So the UN reports that if human populations continue to grow, the stress on our resources, and this is obvious, like lumber, food, water, fiber, and fuel, will be overconsumed. The continuous alterations to our ecosystems, the ones that we have implemented to make our life better so that we can have beds and refrigerators and houses, if more people continue to have those comforts to the level that we have, like here in the United States, then we may not be able to provide that for everyone, and that may exacerbate poverty for others. And so if we establish sustainable practices, this may be able to improve the standard of living for a large number of people. The take-home message here is that there is a way to improve the economy and the ecology together. However, we have to work together. There's no way that one side or the other, or one country and not the other, can do this. It's going to be a group effort that we all have to work together. And I will see you in class soon.